Benvinguts i benvingudes al Podcast IDRA. Welcome to IDRA's podcast. We are Claudia Delso and Adrià Rodríguez, myself, two researchers in IDRA. In the second edition of this podcast, we will interview Carolyn Steel. Carolyn is a prominent architect and writer. He taught in the London School of Economics and the Cambridge University, and she has published two books, Hungry Cities and Sitopia. But first of all, let's briefly introduce IDRA. In IDRA, the Urban Research Institute of Barcelona, we work in several areas: commons, right to housing, urbanism, and ecological transition. In all these areas, the production of knowledge, the social struggles, and the possibility of change are connected. And we do urban research to better understand social reality, but also to change it to promote social and ecological justice. So what is our vision of food systems? We consider that each food system is a particular way to organize nature and society, to craft the urban and the rural territories and the interactions between them. And we firmly believe that the right to infrastructures is a fundamental step towards a just ecological transition. How could we foster agroecological practices, for example, without taking over the democratic control of water and land? How could we fix the rift between the urban and the rural without guaranteeing the right to housing or to public transportation? We will give response to some of these questions and many others, but first let's give the word to Carolyn Steel. And Claudia, please, you can proceed with the first question.
Thank you, Adrià, for the presentation. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thank you.
First of all, Professor Steel, we would like to speak about your book, Hungry Cities. Even if it was a book written like more than 10 years ago, it was a book that has been very, very relevant for our institute, for IDRA, and also it was a very relevant book here in Catalonia and in the whole Spanish state. And in this book, in Hungry Cities, you open a fundamental discussion about how food shapes not only the rural, but also the urban territories, and how food systems are a fundamental field to understand where we live. So the first question is around this. No, what brought you to write it, and how do you came up with the idea of seeking to analyze how the food shapes our cities, but also our lives?
Yes, thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, the question of how I came to be writing the book Hungry City is really the story of my life, which I will spare you because we don't have enough time. But essentially, I was studying architecture and I was teaching architecture and practicing architecture. And a big part of the focus of my studies and my work was the city. And the question of what a city really is and what obviously makes a good city. And I think increasingly I found there was something missing from the architectural discourse. Now, kind of 30 years later, I know that what was missing was life, literally. Because I think it's, what we're talking about when we're talking about cities and when we're talking about societies and so on is so complex that, we have a tendency to think in silos, So, I found this very much when I taught at the London School of Economics, which is an incredibly interesting place to look at the problem of a city. But, we had sociologists, we had architects, we had planners, we had economists, we had traffic people, we had, this anthropologists, this whole gamut of different disciplines. And we're all sitting in a room talking about this thing in the middle called the city, but everyone is like a panopticon in reverse. Everyone was kind of looking at this thing from their silo, myself included. And I'm from London, and I just thought, I feel what a city is intuitively, but what I feel the city is not in this space somehow. There's something missing. And it was kind of driving me nuts, if I'm honest, because it's sort of, how can we discuss this thing if the discussion doesn't include what we all intuitively know is really what cities are about? And it was actually in a conversation with a colleague from the LSE And I was desperately searching for a way of introducing the thing that I still couldn't name. I still didn't know it was really life I was trying to inject into the discourse. And I proposed to him that we might write a book together about cities, and it was me, I was literally propositioning him, and I chose a very beautiful space in London, a big bar with, kind of big antlers, sort of deers on the wall. I mean, a kind of crazy space I thought would be interesting to imagine something new in. And it was during that conversation with him, Roger Zagolovich is his name, that I had the idea of describing a city through the lens of food. And it was the April the 19th in the year 2000 at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because this was literally the moment when my life changed. And I remember I got chicken skin, the hair stood up at the back of my head, because I thought, this is my thing. And I'd always been interested in food. My grandparents had a hotel, so I sort of half grew up in a hotel. So the whole intrigue of how food was made and who gets to see it, and the difference between the kitchen, which is all chaos and noise and pots and pans and shouting, and then the restaurant, which is all very kind of calm and demure. And the fact that, the difference between one space and another was determined by this green baize covered door, the service door that swung. And, very, very early on as a child, I'd been intrigued by this space, and the power of it. I now again post-rationalizing, but you could feel the power of this, and the ability as a child to go from one space to the other at will was a form of almost magic. To choose which bit of that journey you got to experience and you got to be aware of was very powerful. So food was in my background, is the point. So when I thought about describing a city through the lens of food, I immediately could feel that was my thing, and I had a lot of trouble not running immediately out of the room to go and work on this idea, because I was so excited. Honestly, it had taken me I was 40 at this point, it had taken me at least 20 years of struggle to get there. And, and I did, immediately start work on the book that would become Hungry City. And I remember I went to a library in London called the London Library, and I just typed the word food into the subject index and, took out the first 10 books that came out and started reading them. And literally, again, within a few days, I thought, my God, saying, how do you feed a city, which very quickly became my question, is a bit like saying, what is urban civilization? This is huge, this is fundamental, this is so important. Why haven't I thought about it before? How was it possible for me to study architecture, to urban design, to be teaching it for, 2 decades, and for food not to even come up? Now it seems incredible, but this was nevertheless the case. And I remember thinking, immediately, I'm not qualified to do this, but then I thought, well, who would be? It's just too big, And then I spent another few years thinking there must be a discipline called food in the city somewhere that, maybe it's round the back of the shelves I've never been on in the library, and it just didn't exist. So this is just weird. I just, for reasons that I've explained probably at too much length, but nevertheless, actually a very compressed version of what actually happened. Putting those two things together, food and architecture, is a bit like putting together the two most fundamental needs that we have as humans. We need sustenance and we need a place to live. And, that was what I did, you could say by accident, but it was because of a search, because I was in one discipline, the dwelling bit, but I was missing the animal bit, the nourishment bit. And I guess because of my life story, my background, I just happened to put those two things together. And it turns out to have been, something that was indeed, needing to be put together. And we historically we can talk about why food had become invisible to people designing dwellings, actually, because that in itself is a fascinating historical fact. But anyway, that's how I came to do it. And 8 years later, out popped a book called Hungry City, and it came out the same year as the great banking crisis, the meltdown, which of course then became a food crisis. So I think it happened to catch a wave at that time. And I haven't gone back to the day job.
Yeah, following with this idea of how food shapes cities, let's take in consideration the territory where we are now. No? We are in Barcelona, we are in Catalonia, and here there is like a clear industry that really is shaping the territory. No? And I'm speaking about like the pig industry, which is one of the, main food industries in the whole of Spain, and it's very, very important in Catalonia. And for example, the Catalan pig industry, to share like some data, while the livestock in Catalonia contributes to the 64% of the total agricultural production, so it means, big
in pigs.
Yeah. And within the livestock sector, the pig sector stands with more than the 50%, so 56% of the whole livestock production of Catalonia are pigs. Okay, so how does this industry shape the territory where we are? How the pig industry shapes Catalonia? So this industry has crafted the territory in its uses and in its shape. No, the way we use water or the way we use certain infrastructures. No, and there is like, for example, one infrastructure that is very representative of this. It's called the Eix Transversal Highway. It's a highway. It's called also the Pig Belt Highway because it's mainly like the key infrastructure where all the like trucks with pigs are being transported all around this territory. Or, for example, the Port of Barcelona. And another data, very representative for the infrastructure of the port, is that the 44% of the total soya beans imported by the Spanish state are entering by the port of Barcelona. So here we have like a clear understanding of this idea of how food shapes the territory and the cities. No, so can you tell us a little bit more about this idea about how food really shapes the territories and give some like illustrative examples of that?
Sure. And by the way, you make very good ham here, I will say. All these pigs, their lives are not being wasted necessarily. But the whole question, so the subtitle of Hungry City is How Food Shapes Our Lives, and the whole idea of the book really is that everything living is shaped by food because everything living has to eat. And, our landscapes, our cities, but also our bodies, our minds, our habits, our emotions, our politics, our economics, our climate, all of it is shaped by food. And if you like, the big idea is that food is life itself. And therefore you look at, for example, as you say, the example of Barcelona and its surrounding countryside. Well, the countryside, how does a food culture evolve? Let's put that question to ourselves. What a food culture is a way of living well in a particular territory. So historically, of course, before about 12,000 years ago, humans were all hunter-gatherers. This means that they lived in the most fertile territories because there were very, very few humans around, probably maximum 10 million. And they lived in all the best places to get food, of course, because like any other animal, they went to where the food was. So this means river deltas, it means springs in forests, it means, places where there's lots of fruit on trees and there's animals to hunt and so on. Then, making an incredibly long and complex story extremely short, trying to... round about 12,000 years ago, people started farming, and they did it mostly, to begin with, in the Fertile Crescent, which is an area of the ancient Near East, and there's complex reasons why they started to do that. But in essence, what changed when we started farming is, if you think about it, when you're a hunter-gatherer, you follow the food around a territory, you move around. Whereas when you're farming, you're investing in a particular piece of territory, and so you stay put. And this is a gross oversimplification of a very complex concept. But nevertheless, once I've saved some seed and I've maybe bred it so its seeds are bigger and all the rest of it, and I've watered it and I've protected it, I don't wander off so some deer can come along and eat it. So I stay put. So we start to see the beginning of static settlements. That's not to say that some hunter-gatherers weren't semi-static before, but we start to see the co-evolution over time of farming and cities. And what that means is that we see the co-evolution over time of urban bits of land. I often call it the fried egg model of urbanity, where the yolk of the egg is the city and the white of the egg is the countryside feeding it. So a sort of productive territory around the city and the city itself. And this was the sort of the often repeated urban model in the ancient world. But of course, what was produced in a particular place varied massively, because it depended on the territory. So it could be pigs in a mountainous area with lots of acorns, perfect pig country, or it could be grain somewhere else, or it could be bananas. It depends where people settled. So again, over time, as the complexity of our diet shrank down, so fascinatingly, we're doing a lot of studies now, we humans are doing a lot of studies now on the few humans left who still live as hunter-gatherers, and the Hadza in Tanzania are now, I think they have a sort of Western crew descending on them every 3 minutes, wanting to measure their microbiomes and so on. But the average Hadza eats about 300 different types of food a week, and they're all wild foods. So this is an incredibly healthy diet. But when we started domesticating plants and animals, we shrank that down to about 12 key plants and animals that we were basically inviting into our homes and saying, get fatter, tamer, bigger, juicier, and I'll eat more of you. So it's a kind of very interesting deal that we do with the plants and animals that we choose to eat, because there are many, many other plants and animals we could be eating that we choose not to eat, by the way. So it's impossible to do short answers to your questions because everything is life, the universe and everything. But anyway, just to say, ultimately food shapes the territory, but it shapes it because we are finding ways of living well in a particular territory is the point. And as I say, that is what food culture is. And many, many food cultures are thousands of years old, ultimately, because they stem from when we began to farm. And that's when we really began to modify nature to suit us. And we chose what was good in a particular territory and said, okay, I'm going to favour you, banana, or I'm going to favour you, wheat, or pig, or whatever it is. And then those animals and plants start to dominate. And then, of course, the landscape starts to, be modified to suit the plant and animal we've chosen. So this is how it starts to become a very artificial landscape and a very manipulated one, a domesticated one, you could say. Actually, interestingly, the Romans explicitly called it a second nature, so they named it, as a sort of the tame farmland around a city was second nature, as opposed to first nature, which was wild, which is quite interesting. And absolutely then, within that kind of territory that gets established, and of course, as cities get bigger, the territory moves further and further away, and we see, for example, with the, ancient Rome, the first city to have 1 million citizens, that the modified territory that's feeding it can be hundreds of miles away, across the Mediterranean or up in the Black Sea even, or around the Atlantic coast. The sea was important because that's how you transported the food. But you see then that, we have cities or static human settlements, then modifying nature a long, long way away. And it's basically then about how does the food get in to the city? What's that journey? How is it transported? Who controls it? Who owns it? Where is it traded? This is the structure of Hungry City, is the journey of food through the city, which ideally would be a cycle. And in many, many medieval cities was a cycle, but of course now is not a cycle often. It's just a one-way journey. Suck nutrients out of somewhere, the other side of the world. Suck it up and then give nothing back, maybe pay some money, but that doesn't replace the nutrients in the soil. So we have a disrupted cycle. But historically, it used to be grow the food, get it into the city, buy and sell it, cook it, eat it, and back into the land again. So it was a kind of, the nutrient cycle was complete, if you like. Anyway, that's not very short, but still quite short, given the complexity of the subject. Answer to how food shapes territories, but also everything else about our lives.
Also, very connected to this, in your book, Hungry Cities, you have a chapter dedicated to land.
Yes.
In IDRA, we consider that land is a fundamental structure for reproduction of life, not only for food systems. And we are starting to analyze, land tenure, and the crisis of land tenure in the sense that how for small farmers, it's more difficult to the access to land, while big companies are grabbing land. And this is well, this is a phenomenon that we are. It's happening not only in the metropolitan area of Barcelona and in Catalonia, but we could say that it's a global process. Land grabbing by big companies, not only agribusiness companies, but even financial companies that have nothing to do with food. And this process not only shapes food production, but also, well, what we eat and where we eat it, in which way. What would you say about the connection between land tenure, food systems, and the shaping of the territory?
Yeah, it's fundamental. So it's all about power and control. This is ancient, obviously, because as soon as you have cities, and by the way, lots of philosophers already in the 17th century are writing about this. Basically, it becomes the basis of the argument for ownership, comes out of recognition. Descartes writes about this. He actually says, farming basically ruined humanity because we were all happy when we were running around kind of pulling berries off trees. But as soon as somebody drew a square around a bit of land and said, that's mine, which of course you have to do when you're farming, you can't. If you're investing work in a farm, you can't have people wandering along and nicking your food. So immediately the idea of farming itself implies ownership, control, keeping people out, which Descartes recognized, and then John Locke wrote about this. So John Locke, he really was the sort of the father of the capitalist idea of land ownership, if you like. He rationalizes the fact that, if you're going to farm, you need a certain amount of land to feed yourself from. And everyone deserves to eat because surely God wouldn't have, this is his argument, surely God wouldn't have made the earth and then put humans on it and then expected them to starve. So he must expect us to feed ourselves. And in John Locke's mind, farming is much more efficient than hunter-gathering because you can just produce more. So that surely is morally correct. And therefore, everyone has a right to own a bit of land or to have exclusive access to enough land to feed themselves, but only enough to feed themselves, and then the next person has another bit of land to feed themselves. But it's the beginning of this mentality that leads to what you're talking about, because of course the Europeans with this idea in mind then go to America, where actually it's inhabited only by hunter-gatherers, and go, oh, great, nobody seems to be farming, we can take all this land for ourselves. Because they couldn't see what the Native Americans, how they were inhabiting the land, which didn't happen to involve fences. So it's an ancient problem, is all I'm saying. And it goes in waves. So it goes in waves of as it were, indigenous people or whoever it is who happens to be inhabiting land getting shoved off it, so people can farm. And then often the original farmers then get shoved off again, as you say, by bigger farmers, and so it goes and so it goes. And we're probably reaching an extreme end of this process to the extent that, as you say, now it's actually nation states buying up, is China buying up Africa, basically, to future-proof itself against, basically not being able to feed its people. So it's a massive problem. And it comes down in the end. By the way, I am going to mention the Garden City model because I think it's very interesting in this respect, and I'm not sure we're going to come back to it again. But, how do you get... So, it's very, easy to sort of understand on a kind of practical level that it is still true, it remains the case that we all need access to land as human beings in order to thrive. We need a place to live. Going back to my original point about the two key needs of, nourishment on the one hand and a place to dwell, those both involve land. So we need land, but it doesn't have to be exclusively ours. This is the interesting bit. We can share it. We can have principles of commons, which have got, the trouble is we need about 800 hours to go through all this in enough detail, but most land used to be common land, which was basically used by a whole community to graze their animals or whatever. And actually forests were usually common land as well, and they used to sort of supplement their diets by going into the forest and doing a bit of hunting, gathering berries, etc., etc. So there was a kind of, you could say, hunter-gatherer element still in the farming everyday life, right until now, actually. It still exists in certain parts, yeah. So how do we preserve this? How do we interrupt this kind of idea of ownership, which is really sort of, in a sense, exclusive ownership, which in a sense is kind of, just destroys the whole model of it's let's say the landowners are taking over everything, because we also have capitalism at work here, and as we know, if we've read Thomas Piketty, the problem with capitalism is it works for a bit, until you can earn more money by already being rich than you can by actually working, and then it completely stops working, and we're totally in that phase of it now. And you don't need me to tell you that, you just have to switch on the news and see what's going on in America, for example. I mean, basically, billionaires are multiplying like, I was going to say rats, but that's probably a bit, but they're just multiplying and crazily. So it's a complete world out of kilter. So I mean, the theoretical answer to your question is that we need a completely new take on land ownership, I believe. And this is why I'm really interested in the garden city model, because it's not a very well-known fact that the garden city, which is a very well-known idea, and just in case people haven't heard of it, the idea of a garden city is a new city, but a small city built in the middle of nowhere, quote unquote, or in the middle of a sort of rural area, but surrounded by farmland that is protected and that is dedicated to feeding the city. So it's kind of a reversion to the city-state model. And it was a guy called Ebenezer Howard who came up with this idea, in 1902, so, 120 years ago or something. But what I find really interesting is that he was himself inspired by an American economist called Henry George. And in fact, there is a sort of form of economics called Georgism, which comes from the book that George wrote, which is called Progress and Poverty. And Progress and Poverty, I mean, it's a very, very interesting book. It was extremely popular at the time. It actually outsold the Bible for a few years when it came out. Because he witnessed, should I just carry on? Anyway, he was living in San Francisco, and he witnessed what happened when the railways came to San Francisco. And what happened was people who happened to have land right by the railway station got really rich overnight, having done absolutely nothing. And he said, hang on a minute, this is weird. San Francisco used to be a really nice city, and everyone just got on, and everyone roughly earned the same, and blah, blah, blah. And then the railways come, and suddenly you've got some really, really rich people, and therefore poor people around them, because once you've got really rich people, it creates poverty by definition. So this is why the book is called Progress and Poverty. But he said the rich guys did nothing. They just happened to be lucky enough to have land by the railway track. It was somebody else who built the railway. And if you like, it was society who built the railway. So his thinking was, going back to John Locke, the world was created and we live on it. And at what point did it become okay to say, that's my bit, get off? There's no legitimate reason for that. We've just done it for hundreds of years. But can we please rethink it and say, all of humanity needs all of the world. And therefore, the world is a commons for everyone. But clearly, if I want to build a house somewhere or I want a farm, I need exclusive use of enough land to have a farm or a house. But that is depriving somebody else of that land, and therefore I have to acknowledge the fact that I have a debt to society because I'm taking a bit of what belongs rightfully to it away. I will pay society a rent for the exclusive use of that land, and it's called land value rent, and basically, or land value tax. And it's based on the value of your land. So if I'm a poor farmer and all I grow is enough food to feed myself, basically my land is not worth very much, so I pay virtually nothing. If I'm a property developer and I've got a 100-story building and I'm earning millions out of that bit of land, I pay a lot of rent back to society. So it's really, really interesting idea because it kind of neutralizes the value of land, and it actually keeps farmland as farmland, but it makes cities denser. It has this effect over time, which is kind of what we want. So I think it's a really interesting model. Of course, the question is in the detail, how do you actually get there? But as an idea, I think it's really interesting. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a complicated question, but I mean, just to bring it back to the basics, the fundamentals, we all need land in order to survive. So access to land should be a human right, and of course, food also comes from land. So you can deal with these questions, and you can ask how we should share nicely, also through food, which comes from land.
Mm-hmm.
Now we are moving from the land into the supermarket.
Aha, yes.
which is another like field, and especially the explosion of the supermarket. It's something that you dedicate like one super interesting chapter where you explain like this historical also perspective of, I mean, when supermarket like started to appear and this boom of supermarkets. And I have different quotes underlined in my book where you said, for example, supermarket contradict the idea of a city, no? Or supermarkets are the establishment through which the global food highways enters our cities and connects us individually, no? So, but supermarkets at the end are like big corporations, intermediaries, that indeed what are doing are concentrate more and more and more power within the food system, no? And that power, it's actually defining what we are eating, the price, the precedent, the composition of the food. So, and coming again to where we are now, it happened this weird thing here in Barcelona, which is like we have this amazing network of public markets, like public infrastructure in all the neighborhoods. So more than 40 markets, 47, I guess. And as a public policy to revitalize this public infrastructure, what we did was to introduce supermarkets inside the public market. So actually, I mean, we are also conditioning the characteristic and actually the sense of this public infrastructure to guarantee like the access to like fresh and good products, and also even like the prices. So in your opinion, in which ways is the power of supermarkets shaping our territories and cities and our bodies? And at the end, I mean, the power of these big food corporations that are actually like arriving through all the cities and actually through all of our lives.
Okay, so this is going to be another 20-minute answer because you've raised a lot of enormous questions again. But I mean, just to say, control of food is power. This should be obvious, because we have to eat. So if I need that food, but you say, but you're going to have to give me X, Y, and Z, or I'll only give it to you if X, blah, blah, then you have no power. The person controlling the food has power. And this, again, is an ancient problem. Very, very briefly, in the very first cities ever built, we saw immediately a social hierarchy developing where, you know, unlike in a hunter-gatherer society where the good hunters who feed the band are the leaders, in the city, what happened was the farmers got excluded because the food distribution was done by the temples, and the temples then became powerful and decided, okay, we're going to harvest your field tomorrow, and then we'll do yours, and you know, you have to wait till next week, kind of thing. So immediately we see it's control of food, distribution of food where the power is. Another very obvious example is, why is Amsterdam so beautiful? Because the Dutch controlled the Baltic grain trade for about 300 years. Very, very good business, known as the Golden Trade. Anyway, that's another long story. Anyway, but so if we look at what a market is, and as you say, you know, this transition from market to supermarket is very, very symptomatic of what happened to cities through the process of industrialization. So if we look at, I was talking about my journey of food before, so we had, you know, the pig maybe walking into market, gets into the market, gets slaughtered, and then is bought and sold in that physical space. So basically, historically, the market, I mean, it's quite interesting because I was just walking around the Gothic quarter of Barcelona this morning, and it's amazing how all these really tight little streets, and you really feel how dense the medieval city was. And then when you get into an open space, it's a big relief, and you can really feel the power of those spaces just as a place where everybody could gather. You know, so basically the public space of the city, but it was also where the food was traded. And so this, you know, if you like, food and politics are inseparable for this reason, you know, historically in the city anyway, because everybody had to go to the market because you couldn't keep food fresh for more than a day or so. So, as you say, markets historically were the place where you went to get fresh food, which most people needed every day. I mean, often in cities people would subsist on preserved foods, so salted meats or cheeses or things like bread that maybe you could last for a few days. But really fresh food you could only buy immediately and then eat immediately. And so there was an immediacy to the market, but it was also the place of every man and woman and child. Everybody went there. So the fact that it was the only open space meant that it was also a place for celebration, for, rioting or whatever else was going on, meant that, food was the great connector. It was the animator of public space. It was also the place where everybody met one another through a shared need, which is eating. And of course, beyond the market, you then have cafes and taverns and bars and, the whole thing sort of reverberates away. But the market is the core. Now, what happens when we transition? So it's the railways, again, that are critical. When the railways come, if you think about the way food is suddenly distributed, it's no longer local farmers just coming in, with their wagon and here's some beans that I grew yesterday, because the food can suddenly travel rapidly long distances. And this is what really sort of changes the relationship between the city and the countryside. And, out of that we get many things, but we get the commodification of food. So, for example, in America, North America, where, basically most of the internal area was just, it was grassland, it was bison, and it was Native Americans living with them. Once the railways came, it was possible to turn that grassland into grainland because you could then transport the grain easily. So Farmer Jones doesn't come into the city anymore. He goes to a grain silo somewhere on a railway track. Somebody looks at his wagon and goes, oh, that's grade A, B, or C, and it goes into a silo, at which point it's no longer Farmer Jones's grain, it's a commodity called, grain grade A, B, or C, and then it goes into the city and is traded as a neutral thing. So if you like, we start to see the dehumanization of food trading. And then the next phase, sorry, I did say it's going to be 20 minutes, but it's complicated, but it's really, really important, because what we're talking about is, as I say, something as important as who controls food, but also food's function to bring people together and to sort of to really encourage commonality, a sense of commonality. Once you've got food coming into the city as a kind of commodity, and once transport becomes, a much bigger deal, because the food's it's all about food logistics at this point and how you move the food around, then you get economies of scale and you get, sort of economies, efficiencies in the chain, which mean that it makes more and more sense to have, bigger and bigger fields, bigger and bigger companies moving it around, and kind of food hubs. And the most expensive part about feeding a city is the last bit, because driving, just stick on food on a train and making it go 1,000 miles, no problem. Getting it into the higgledy-piggledy middle bit of a city, very difficult. So food companies kind of thought, well, why don't we just leave the food on the outside of the city and make people leave the city to go to the food? This is the model. It comes from America. And it is this is why I say supermarkets are anti-urban, because everything I've been describing about why do we live in cities? We live in cities to be with other people. And the whole point is that there's a huge diversity of other people. And where do you go to find that huge diversity of other people? The market. So to subvert that and to say it's no longer about the humans, it's actually just about getting the food, but we cut off the sociable bit, the sort of the nice to meet you bit, and the chance encounters that is, the essence of public life. You've destroyed that absolutely fundamental relationship between people and food, and the trading of food, which was the heartbeat of public life. And of course, the food now, it has to sell itself to you. And this is another thing. So instead of having, a counter and there's butter and there's sugar and there's flour and there's prunes and people come in and say, oh, I'd like a pat of butter. Oh, I'll make you up a pat of butter, get the butter out, start wrapping it up. How's Johnny doing at school? Is Mary passed her exam yet? Blah, 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 blah. And there was a guy in America called Clarence Saunders. He had a string of grocery shops, and he was going around his shops. He's going, I'm not making any money because these people are just chatting and I want them to just sell the butter and move on. And he invented the supermarket. And it was deliberately to exclude the human exchange when you're buying and selling food. So he said, okay, I'm going to wrap the butter up already. It's going to sit on a shelf. And it's going to tell you what it is on the outside and kind of go, buy me, you know. And then to enter, you have to go through a turnstile. The food speaks to you. You buy the food, you stick it in a basket, and you pay, and you leave. And, you know, because everyone's behind you queuing and getting cross, you don't even talk to the person you're paying. So it's dehumanizing the process of buying and selling food. And it's also then the food becomes denatured because it's having to sit on a shelf for, you know, maybe 3 months before you buy it. So then, you know, the invention of basically food, I mean, ultra-processed food, which we now know is the big health issue in food. It was never salt, sugar, and fat. It was always the degree to which it's processed. You get the invention of, you know, sugar that isn't sugar, but it's high fructose corn syrup, or, you know, all of the fats that are hydrogenated, you know, that completely disrupt our digestion. But I mean, you can have a thing called a cake sitting on a shelf for 3 months and it's still edible. That's not food. That's something else. I mean, that's it in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. As you have just said also, and just mentioned, we have been witnessing, and we are witnessing an increasing rift between the rural and the urban, right? Whereby some territories are to produce food, and some territories are only to consume food. You have called this the urban paradox. This paradox, this rift, entails enormous consequences and costs, mostly economic costs, political, social, cultural also. In your opinion, what has to be done to fix this crack, to close this crack, to promote, to resettle the cooperation between the urban and the rural?
Yes. Well, again, this is an ancient question, of course.
As all the questions.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I'm so fascinated by the history, because, you know, we live in a very complex world and it's very difficult to understand. But if you look 5,000 years ago and you go, oh, they had exactly the same problems and they saw it in the same way, and here's what happened. You know, it's like reading a sort of story, an illustrated story of how we got here, and I find it just really helps to understand it. So, for example, I'm now going to mention the ancient Greeks, because, again, they're really important in this story. So I mentioned my fried egg model of urbanity, where the yolk is the city and the white is the countryside around it. This was, you know, I mean, and I'm massively oversimplifying, obviously, but this was the basic model in most pre-industrial cities, although not all of them. And in Greece, I mean, the Greeks were the first people to really ask the question, how should you feed a city? You know, and Plato and Aristotle both asked this question in the context of wondering what an ideal city would look like. And of course, wondering what an ideal city looks like is utopianism. So utopianism is wondering what an ideal society, what an ideal life, what an ideal setup is. So it's really at the beginning of utopianism, we already see the urban paradox, what I call the urban paradox, emerging. And Aristotle, and I find it very interesting that he called humans political animals. I love this phrase because it really highlights the duality that is at the heart of the urban paradox. And it's a similar duality to the one I've been talking about before. So as humans, we have, if you like, two baskets of needs. One is for each other, so we're political, so we need each other. And the other is that we're animals, so we need nourishment, we need nature, and so on. So how do you bring these two things together? And for both Plato and Aristotle, the answer was basically keep the city small. They were very, very clear on this because you had to maintain a strong relationship with the countryside. And the second thing was that the ideal relationship should be between the city and the country, that every citizen effectively feeds themselves, interestingly. So every citizen has a house in the city and a farm nearby in the countryside, and the farm feeds the house. And they call this economia. Economia means household management. And so basically, if every citizen is feeding themselves, they're self-sufficient, that's good economia, but also it means the city is self-sufficient, and this is good economia for the city. Now, this is very interesting because Aristotle says that the good thing about economia is that there's a natural balance between the city and the country, because it doesn't matter how rich you are, there's a limit to how much you can eat. We just have a natural limit. And he warned against, I find this really fascinating, another thing called crematistica, and it's no surprise we haven't kind of used that in our language today, which is the making of money for its own sake. And he says, this can never bring happiness because you will never find a balance. I mean, as you know, the Greeks are big on balance. It's all about harmony and balance and so on. So a greedy person will always want more money, but there will be a limit to how much they can eat. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that if you think of the word economia, that's given us the word, our modern word economy. Now, the answer to your question, to me, in a nutshell, is we need to bring back economia. We need to work out what economia 2.0 looks like. And this means putting value in food. And if we put value in food, which after all is the most valuable things in our lives, I'm quite looking forward to the next time I eat, I usually do. But the fact that, we can't live without food, quite simply, tells you that to live in a society where we don't value food, and I mean, you value it much, much more, by the way, I have to say, in Catalonia than we do back in the UK, and, it's really shocking the extent to which all people in the UK really care about is how much the food costs, and they want it to be as cheap as possible. Now, if you think, as I said at the beginning, food is life, and you want it to be cheap, you can do the rest of the logic. You're cheapening life. Literally, that's what you're doing. So my proposal is that we internalise the true cost of food, and we base our economy back on food. Now, that basically is again, another thing that it's very easy to do theoretically and quite difficult to do in practice, because my proposal is that, if we put a cost on, for example, the global cost of, say, industrially produced meat, it's totally unaffordable. It's because it's destroying the planet. That's the definition of unaffordable. It's also making us sick, of course. It's threatening our future, unaffordable. So how can this food be cheap? By the way, it goes back to Chicago. That's another bit of the story I didn't fill in. But, when they made all those grain fields with all those trains and all that commodified grain, they started feeding it to cows. That's the beginning of cheap industrial meat. Anyway, it all fits together. But so if we did that, food would probably on average cost about double what it costs now. Now, there is a kind of food that already exists that would not be any more expensive. That is organically produced local seasonal food, because all the true costs of that food are already included. There are no externalities. It's not poisoning the landscape. It doesn't involve slavery. It's not making people sick. It's not causing climate change. So we need to transition to this kind of food. But this means that food will be, quote unquote, more expensive. It actually won't be. It'll be much cheaper. It's just that the cost will be at point of purchase rather than in the Amazon or in the climate. So we're already paying those costs societally, but we're just paying them unknowingly and unconsciously. That changes everything. So, but then that means, because my definition of a good society is one in which everybody can eat well, that we have to make sure people can afford this food. But actually it becomes a kind of virtuous circle, because if we value food and pay more for it, then more people will farm, more people will work in food, it will become a good job. So we put the value where the value actually is, and this will automatically solve your problem you're asking me about. This will bring the city and the country closer together again, because if you actually if you charge the externalities of food that's coming all the way up from Brazil, and destroyed a bit of rainforest all the way, then the food that's being grown locally, this is again what Ebenezer Howard recognised with his Garden City, that given a level playing field, and given farmland that's affordable, the market will work, but you have to put the value in food. That's the short version. Again,
you already answered. The next question, which was around this other concept that you invented, the Sitopia.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this place for food?
Yes, and thank you, because it comes directly from. So I was basically studying Utopia, and I was studying the Greeks, and I was studying Thomas More, who also writes about keeping the city small. It's the fried egg again, and Ebenezer Howard's Garden City. And I thought it's really interesting, utopians, they talk all the time about food, they talk all the time about the city and the country and all the rest of it. but they don't put food here. It's just kind of assumed. I mean, by the way, another thing that I say often, because it strikes me as so true, food is too big to see, because we are food. You know, we just wouldn't be here without it. So it's very difficult to actually perceive it, because it's just everywhere. That's the power when you do learn to see through it. Anyway, so as I say, researching utopia. Utopia is a weird word, isn't it? Because it's got that U. Where does that U come from? So the topia bit comes from the Greek word topos, which means place. But the U bit is a kind of joke, because it can either come from the Greek word for good, which is spelled EU, or the Greek word for no, which is spelled OU. So it's a joke word. It means a good place, but no place. So it's ideal, and therefore it can't exist. And I remember reading this and getting really depressed, because I thought, oh my God, you know, utopia is our greatest tradition of thinking in a multidisciplinary way about how we should live, and it can't exist. This is a disaster, because we desperately need that kind of thinking. And then I thought, but they, you know, utopians bang on the whole time about food. They talk about farming, they talk about shared meals, you know, blah, blah, blah. Surely I can just take the food bit out and we can use this as a lens instead. And this is why I invented the word Sitopia, because we live in a Sitopia. So, by the way, it's from sitos, S-I-T-O-S, is the Greek word for food. So it's just food place is what it means. We live in one. We don't, I mean, here in Barcelona, I have to say you live in a pretty good one, because I've been eating a little bit, and you have an incredible food culture here, although it's under threat, of course, which is why I'm talking to you in this studio. It can get much worse, believe me. Come and visit me in London. You know, so basically, we don't live in an ideal Sitopia or a good Sitopia because we don't value food. But the more you value food, I mean, because food shapes everything. It shapes, as I said earlier, the whole world. The more you value food, the better Sitopia gets, and the closer it gets to utopia. And this just works. Because when I go, I mean, good Sitopias exist everywhere. You know, I mean, in markets, in local, you know, food systems, everywhere people care about food and they value it and they take time for it, you have a mini good Sitopia. So this is the power of Sitopia. It already exists, and we can change it for the better ourselves immediately by tomorrow not choosing, you know, industrially produced bacon for breakfast, but maybe having some organic muesli instead. You know, and that's just a cartoon version, but, you know, by our individual choices, we can change it, and that's real change. That's not pretendy academics in a tower having ideas change, that's actual change, and it can scale up. And then when governments take note, this is when it gets really interesting. This is the critical moment. But anyway, that's the idea of Sitopia, is that literally, because food shapes everything, and it is the most valuable thing in our lives, if we value food and put it at the center of our thinking, what is a good life? What is a good society? How do we balance our lives with nature? How do we share nicely? We can answer all the utopian questions, but we can do it for real. It's a food-based practical alternative to utopia.
In order to walk towards these changes that we need, in order to promote a more sustainable, better, and more ecological, and also better in terms socially, politically, food systems. In IDRA, we have brought the focus towards the role of infrastructures, right? Also in your book, you also have a look at the role of infrastructures, railroad, road, networks, highways, markets. In the case of Barcelona and Catalonia, for example, we could talk about the Barcelona port. The airport also has a role. Also the wholesale market in Barcelona called Mercabarna, which is 100% owned and managed wholesale market, which is not something usual in Europe and probably all around the world. But this wholesale market today has around 700 companies, and it's based 30% on imports and exports. So although it's a publicly managed and owned wholesale market, it's very focused on international exports and imports, and somehow it promotes the globalization of the food system. For IDRA, let's say the management, democratic management, from from the public administration, but also in a coalition with the local communities of the infrastructure is fundamental, not just in social terms, but also in ecological terms. No? We can only think of an ecological and just transition if we think how to take over democratic control of the infrastructures of the food system. In this sense, if you had to envision really sustainable, ecological and social food system, which infrastructures do you think we do need? And which management of these infrastructures you think it's needed?
I mean, it's weird because, I mean, it's quite a dangerous thing to say, but all the models we need exist already. They're just everything we did before fossil fuels, basically. I mean, and it's ironic because if you think about the condition we find ourselves in now, we need to transition towards a much lower energy way of life. And guess what? That's what everybody did until about, mid-19th century. So we have the answers, but the trick is how to get there politically, because basically, I mean, every time I open my mouth and say this, everyone's like, oh, you want us to go back to being medieval peasants? And I go, no, I'm not. I don't, by the way. I quite like my computer, thank you very much. But all the principles are there. So we can do medieval with technology, and it's basically, it's much, much more, I mean, it's quite interesting. It's much, much more filigree networky type shape stuff. So this is systems thinking, basically. And by the way, I haven't started systems thinking, but people keep telling me I'm a systems thinker. Because, I mean, you turn into one if you think about food and how it's distributed. You can't help it. And what's really interesting historically, yet again, is that it has been proven again and again to be completely impossible to control the food supply completely. So whenever anybody tried to do that, people just started doing their own thing around the sides. And of course, it's the same today. I mean, yes, even in our incredibly industrialized, centralized, monopolistic food system, you still got people growing their own stuff in their gardens, their backyards, mate on the farm, etc., etc. So that has always been there. How do we get from the sort of the monopolistic model we have at the moment to, as you say, a much more democratically owned system? Well, obviously, we need everything from politics to economics to societal change. We need to frankly, a completely different view of what a good life looks like. And in fact, this is another important thing to say, and I may as well say it now, because I don't know if we'll come back to it again, that whenever you're saying how should we eat, or whenever you're saying what kind of food system we need, you are also saying how should we live, and what kind of society do we need or want? Because basically, if that's a food system and that society, they're like this. They completely mirror one another. So you cannot live in a democracy and have a monopolistic food system, but ironically, that's what we seem to be doing. So we have to challenge the fundamental principles of this. And if you think about it, I said earlier, control of food is power. Historically, again, in the UK, we got rid of our small-scale farmers about 250 years ago because we had this thing called the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of our problems stem from this. Once people moved off the land and into cities, they became victims, if you like, because they had no control over their food anymore. They lost food sovereignty. That's what happens when you stop farming. Back then, the argument was, oh yeah, but you'll get rich in the factory and life will be a lot better. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I think there's a swindle involved here. And I think we're now still suffering from that basic bargain that was made all that time ago. That basically you give up your independence and your sovereignty for becoming a consumer, a worker and a consumer. And we see people rejecting that bargain all the time. It's really, really interesting. So I'm looking forward to the day when a politician is brave enough to say, okay, guys, we've tried this industrial capitalist thing for a couple of 100 years, and it's had lots of benefits, and we can fly, and we've got iPhones, and yada, yada. But look at all the stuff we left behind. And by the way, we can't carry on doing this anymore because we're running out of fossil fuels. Well, we're actually not running out. That would be helpful if we were, but we're not. but we're running out of climate and planet. So actually, we need to go back to a lot of the things we were doing over here. But here's the really exciting bit. And this is what I really genuinely believe in and thinking a lot about at the moment. All the stuff that we left behind in pursuit of this industrial good life over here is what really makes us happy. So everything that we need in order to really flourish as humans is primal. We don't need anything that hunter-gatherers don't have. Think about it. We need good health. They've got that. They're eating 300 wild things a week. You know, we need a sense of sociability, belonging, meaning. They've got that in spades. We need individual skills, agency, closeness to nature. Oh, hello, I'm living in it. Time. I mean, you know, the great thing that, I mean, very, very famously, and to my mind, extremely erroneously, Benjamin Franklin famously said, time is money. Time is not money. Time is life. So we need to take back this idea of what a good life is. And food, of course, sits at the heart of all of it. So if we basically try to imagine a different kind of good life, as I say, the models are all there, and they're to do with smaller groups of people, democratic ownership, collaboration. We saw it under COVID. I mean, this naturally started happening under COVID because people couldn't come into the city. So they all stayed in their commuter towns, and suddenly the commuter town became an interesting place. Suddenly the cafes were doing a lot better and people were collaborating. They were, you know, pubs started to become food hubs. People were kind of getting food for one another. They were, I mean, honestly, it's incredible how quickly this happened. And now, surprise, surprise, people don't want to go back to their old life of sitting in in London, you know, everyone famously commutes for 2 hours a day. So you're sitting in a germ-ridden metal tube going backwards and forwards, you know, and people are going, oh, I quite like staying at home and just doing it on Zoom. That's not, of course, the ideal answer because we need physical contact. But what it does tell you is that if we're given the opportunity to discover what a good life can be like when you have time, you have space, you have nature, you have agency, you have sociability, all those primal things that COVID showed us the importance of, either by giving it to us or denying it to us, it's a completely different model. And it's a low-energy model. This is what's really interesting, because instead of consuming stuff, you make stuff. Or you talk to a human being. You know, you don't just kind of wander around like this the whole time, you know. So anyway, I mean, that is, again, a sort of rather long answer to your question, but I think it comes down to this. It comes down to really having the bravery to say that the 19th century and 20th century idea of a good life we've inherited is no longer fit for purpose. We need a 21st century idea of a good life, which is low energy, but it restores all the primal sources of flourishing that we've lost through the whole 200 years of pursuing this other crazy industrial capitalist good life, which we don't completely reject. We take the good bits, but then we also put back in the stuff that we jettisoned along the way because it didn't matter.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
As you have said, there's so much to be said, and also there's so much to be done. So thank you very much for the interview.
Yeah, and thanks for thinking together.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me, and good luck with your work. It's really great to hear about it, and I look forward to collaborating in the future too.
Sure, and thank you also for the people who have been listening. And we encourage you to read Carolyn's books and also to follow up the activities of IDRA in our social media, and see you in the next podcast.